Hello, everybody. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today we are in the wilderness, ye old desert behind us, fighting some wildebeests and talking about archaeology, specifically the Mesha Stele and 2 Kings 3. There's a big discussion in scholarship. Is this text 2 Kings 3, is it historical? Is the Mesha Stele, is it historical? But there's also the question of whether it has contradictions or even verifies that King David was a historical person. See, this text, the Mesha Stele, as you see on the screen, bam! Oh, gotta press on that button there. Can't be seeing that. The Mesha Stele, it looks pretty awesome. A cool little text here. What's on this little Mesha Stele? It has a lot of things that verify the same stuff that happens in the Bible in 2 Kings. It talks about the same people. It even mentions Yahweh, one of the earliest mentions of Yahweh. And as I said before, King David is even mentioned on this text. That's really, really cool. But it's a really confusing and interesting topic. So we're going to talk about it today. People might have seen my video with Dr. Todd Bolin where we talked about his understanding of the text. People should watch that. Today we're going to dive deeper into the topic. We're going to talk about the different ways that scholars view this text to get a better understanding of it. Now, we've got Moses underneath here. He's with us here today. We're going to chat about this awesome finding. So, let's talk about 2 Kings 3. So, this well, actually we're going to go back to that later, but let's talk about how this is historically verifiable for the Bible. So, this stele that you see on the screen here, that has a lot of things that verify things that are mentioned in the Bible. That's really, really cool. You don't get that all the time because a lot has been lost in history. Specifically, the Mesha, king of Moab. So Mesha is mentioned in the Bible and this stone, the Moabite stone, the Mesha Stele. Also, Mesha has been subject to Israel under the Amorites. So this talks about how Mesha, this King Mesha guy, is under control of Israel, just like the biblical text says. If it wasn't already clear, this text was created a little bit after Israel has King Solomon and King David as their king. So a little bit after that. And in this text, it also affirms 2 Kings 3 in that the Israelite God was Yahweh. Also, Mesha rebelled and gained his independence from the Amorite dynasty. It's mentioned in there too, in both texts. Also, Mesha was responsible for the flocks. That's a really interesting detail. Both texts say that this Mesha king was in charge of sheep. That's really interesting. Also, Mesha was a man who could take human life as a religious act of devotion to his God. The Mesha inscription and 2 Kings 3 talk about how this Mesha guy was willing to kill pretty much anybody to get what he wanted. So Mesha dedicates these cities, human people, 7,000 men and women, to his God. He kills them as an act of devotion to his God. Also, in the 2 Kings text, it says that Mesha gave his son, child sacrifice to his God in order to gain victory. Also, the Mesha inscription focuses on the north, but both texts affirm that there was a military campaign in the south of the Arnon River. So that's a really very specific detail. And also that both give Edom motivation to stand up to Mesha. So we're going to get into each of these as we go, but it's just really, really cool text that verifies a lot about what the biblical text says. The biblical text it's not just made up information, as a lot of people want to say. It's not false things that were just made up for propaganda. No, it has historical information in it. Let's talk about 2 Kings 3. So in this text, there's this guy named Ahab, and he is the king of Israel. And then Mesha rebels against Israel. So Mesha was under control of Israel. These Moabites were under control, and they were giving tribute to Israel. Otherwise, Israel was going to go take them out, going to beat them up. And Mesha was like, I've had enough of this. As soon as this Ahab guy dies, Mesha says, I'm done with this. We're fighting Israel. We're gaining our independence. And then the king of Israel, this guy named Jehoram, this other nation, Judah, with the king named Jehoshaphat, as well as the nation Edom, who the king is not named in that, they all ally together. They say, oh, this Mesha guy, we can't let him get in control, so we got to take him out. We got to ally together. We're going to go fight against Mesha. And then there's this coalition. But the problem is that the route they go doesn't have a lot of water. And the kings are like, this might have been a bad decision. Maybe God, Yahweh, is trying to tell us something. Tell us that we shouldn't be doing this. Maybe this is a sign. But Judah's king, no, Judah's king was the good guy. And he's like, let's ask Yahweh. Let's just get his advice before we really make a decision without talking to him first. And there just happened to be Elisha the prophet, the famous Elisha the prophet. He tells these three kings to go dig some pits, which eventually fill with water. Hey, they can drink this water. But not only does it give them water to drink, it eventually causes the Moabites to think that these three kings, that they went and attacked and killed each other, and there was this big fight, and the Moabites were like, shoot, this is our chance to take advantage of this. We gotta attack them when they're weak. And it turns out that, well, they weren't actually attacking each other. The Israelites were just digging, and it worked out really well, because the Israelites caught the Moabites off guard. Moabites thought they were going to get an easy win, and the Israelites, the three kings, they were like, ping, 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 and just totally knocked them out, destroyed them, all except for one city. And what happened at this city is that this Mesha guy says, I'm going to sacrifice my son to make sure that the gods know what's up, that the gods should help me out. I'm going to sacrifice my son, because if I completely devote my son's life to that, then they're going to help us out. And that's actually, there's a lot of debate in this passage about why the change occurs, but the Israelites go from going on to the offensive to all of a sudden retreating. It doesn't tell us why. It just says that there's some wrath. It doesn't tell us what God or what happened, but it says there was some wrath, and man, the Israelites retreat. So Kir Hareseth, it doesn't get destroyed. Mesha's still in charge of that place. And then the passage ends, as I said before, with Mesha sacrificing heir to the throne as a burnt offering, which causes great wrath upon Israel, and Israel returns to their own land. Not the ending what we hoped for there. You might be thinking, okay, well, what does the Mesha Stele say about this? So, a lot of scholars think the Mesha Stele is talking about the same exact thing. That's really interesting. So, the Mesha Stele, it talks about this dynastic rule. Mesha succeeded his father, and this father was in charge during the time of well, supposedly Omri, or maybe Omri's descendants. It's not terribly clear there, but Mesha's father, Mesha becomes in charge, and he ruled in Moab for 30 years. And what this text talks about is there was lots of divine favor. Chemosh, he's like, I'm gonna help you guys out. And Mesha credits Chemosh the god with delivering from his enemies and enabling his victories. You can read the text on the right if you want to. It also talks about conflict with Israel. Israel, under King Omri and his son, likely Ahab or Jehoram, we'll get into the whole family later, they had oppressed Moab for decades, just like the biblical text says. Chemosh was said to be angry, allowing this oppression. So the text is like, hey, I'm mad at you, Moabites, so I'm going to let the Israelites lead. That's essentially what it says. Of course, that's kind of interesting point where it's like, well, they're in charge of us, therefore it must be the God who's allowing it, right? Chemosh must be allowing it. But Mesha claims to have defeated Israel and caused its downfall. So in this text, Mesha claims it defeats Israel. And in this text, it talks about military campaigns. It says Mesha recaptured territories such as Mahadeba and Ataroth from Israel. He slaughtered entire populations in cities like Nebo and Ataroth, dedicating them to Chemosh. He seized sacred vessels of Yahweh and brought them to Chemosh. There were building projects. They constructed multiple cities, built reservoirs, city walls, gates, towers, highways, royal palace, ordered cisterns to be made in each house, and used Israelite prisoners for labor. There's a conquest of the house of David. So this mentions the house of David. That's really, really cool. And it talks about how the location was inhabited by the house of David, suggesting a Moabite conflict with a Jewite polity. That's just nerd language there. And it claims Chemosh instructed and helped him conquer it. So, this has brought a lot of questions because you might have noticed that description is very different than 2 Kings 3. Is it about the same thing? Is it about something different? And why does the 2 Kings 3 text seem like the Israelites were all in control, they're about to win, and then all of a sudden they lose at the end? But the Mesha Stele doesn't mention anything about the Israelites ever really getting anywhere close to winning. So what happened there? It doesn't mention anything about the supposed blood. And Ty Bowen's like, hey, maybe these are talking about different things or what. But it also talks about the beginning of the Mesha Stele talks about the how the Israel was in control of the Moabites and Mesha, and then Mesha rebelled. So that's very similar with the 2 Kings 3. So what's going on here? Let's talk about that. So scholars throughout the years have made a number of different arguments for why the 2 Kings 3 text is not historical. That it's got things that we wouldn't expect in a historical text. We're going to talk about that specifically from the perspective of a Hebrew scholar named Joe Sprinkle. And he wrote this really great article that you can read right here. Joe Sprinkle, 2 Kings 3, History or Historical Fiction. And he argues that the 2 Kings 3 text, he makes an argument and tries to essentially come up with a way that the 2 Kings 3 text could be historical and not contradict with what we know about history. So there's all these arguments, and Joe's like, hey, no, we can figure out if we understand this way, it's actually historical, what they call the maximalist case. So I'll summarize a lot of these arguments here, but there's a lot more. There's a lot of arguments for it not being historical. We're going to see if we can address some of those. Some of them are good, some of them are not too good. The Edomite king issue. The chronological conflict. There's a number of different chronological conflicts that seem to be happening in the two texts. Mesha's rebellion. There's confusion over identities. There's differences in geography. There's content differences. Battle details are different between the texts. Tribute and campaign route issues. Elisha's presence is a little odd. Archaeological science seem things we would expect. We don't really see in the archaeology. There's omissions in the text, and in both of them actually. And literary and theological parallels. That's a really fun one. So let's talk about this. First, we're going to talk about how there is a reference to the king of Edom in 2 Kings 3. It's the third one that the name of the king is not named in this coalition. And what these scholars are arguing, that's in contradiction with other texts in Kings that imply there was no king in Edom at this time. 1 King 22:47 says there was no king in Edom. A deputy was a king. And 2 Kings 8:20 says, in the time of Jehoram, Edom rebelled against Judah and set up its own king, which some said, hey, maybe that implies there was no king. Well, Kogan and Tam will respond by saying, it would not, however, be unusual for the same official to be referred to as a deputy in a chronistic source and a king in a prophetic narrative. Basically, what he was saying is sometimes kings were called different things depending on the context. So when it says there was no king in 1 Kings 22, maybe it's referring to like a specific type of king, while 2 Kings 3 says that it was a king using the same word but different idea. That's possible. 2 Kings 8:20. Now, Brickto and actually it's Sprinkle who says this. Sprinkle says that the text does not state that there had been no king in Edom up to that time. It could simply mean that they replaced the puppet king or deputy approved by Judah with one of their own liking. And Sprinkle mentions how this is given more evidence because the 2 Kings 3 text, it doesn't mention the king. He doesn't talk it at all. So maybe that's why he's called a deputy in the 1 Kings 22 text, because he wasn't actually a king, or he didn't do the role as the king. He didn't really act like it. So you can call him a king, but he isn't really a king. So I'll let you guys handle that as you may. Also, the Bible states that Mesha rebelled after Ahab died. So it's not a big deal. That makes sense. And that is basically what the biblical text and Mesha Stele says. But it also says Mesha and his own inscription state that it was during the reign of Omri's son that he rebelled, which would presumably be during, not after, the reign of Ahab. Additionally, Mesha's attribution to Omri and his son, supposedly Ahab, of a 40-year domination of Moab in line 8 cannot be easily reconciled with biblical chronology. So we're going to get into that into specific details. The Mesha inscription seems to imply Omri was alive after this 40 years. That wouldn't make any sense at all if that's the case. So Sprinkle responds by saying that from the Israelite perspective, Mesha's rebellion began after the death of Ahab. Since the nature of this rebellion is a failure to send tribute to Israel, from the Moabite perspective, it could have started even before the death of Ahab, but non-payment of tribute took some time to register in Samaria. So in other words, these people are writing depending on their perspective. So if you have different payments of tribute, and it's not going to be automatic, right? You're going to write depending on what's going on, and your perspective might be different depending on your situation. Or, Sprinkle says, if Omri's son is in the inscription refers to Jehoram, as will be argued below, there's no discrepancy at all. So the Mesha Stele, it only mentions Omri and Omri's son. It doesn't tell you the specific name of Omri's son. So there's a question. You see Omri right here, and Omri's first son was Ahab. But that's a bit of a problem because Ahab, we know from archaeology that Ahab was a very strong king at this time period. So it wouldn't make sense for Mesha to rebel when Ahab's really strong. That wouldn't make much sense. On the other hand, this guy named Ahaziah, he only reigned for about 2 years. That's pretty unlikely that the text of the Mesha Stele would be talking about this guy named Ahaziah when he was just barely in it. Like just the chances of that happening are slim. On the other hand, the Second Kings 3 talks about this guy named Joram or Jehoram, and that's that matches up with the Mesha Stele if you understand Jehoram as the son of Omri, even though he wasn't the direct son. We'll talk about that in a second. And just for clarity here, there's another guy named Jehoram, but it's a different king, different nation. So we're gonna go back here, and by the way, this is the map. So Kir Hareseth, a lot of people think that is modern day Kirak, but we'll talk about how later up in the north there is another proposed destination, and that'll change the conversation. Before we get into it, this is what they call the Nahal Arnon. It's essentially this huge area of land where it kind of dips down, kind of like the reverse of a mountain. It dips down, and that's a big border for these areas because it's really hard to get a army to go through there because the other army can be on the other side just shooting down, have the height advantage. So it's really difficult to go over that terrain there. And if we look at the text or the map here, you have the Judean desert, Israel and Judah. They're going to be on the left side here, so they're going to have to go to this land of Moab, and they have to fight. So we're going to talk about that in a second, but I just wanted people to understand the area there. So we're going to go back to our little perspectives here. So as I was saying before, the question is, who is the son that is mentioned in the Mesha Stele? Is it Ahab, Omri's first son, or is it Jehoram, someone mentioned later but still a descendant of Omri? And Sprinkle's like, hey, if Omri's son in the inscription refers to Jehoram, as will be argued below, there's no discrepancy at all. So that makes perfect sense if that's the case. Now, the next thing that scholars mention is that the Mesha Stele seems to state Jehoram is of Judah, but he's actually of Israel. So the son of Omri that's mentioned in the Mesha Stele says that Jehoram, or whoever the son is, of Judah, but in reality he's of Israel. So that's a little confusing. It seems to be almost a contradiction. Which one's right? And the easy thing to say is that, hey, well, it is Israelite. It is Israel's source. The Jews are writing this text of 2 Kings 3. So it makes more sense that they would probably be the ones to get it right, considering it's their own history. On the other hand, Mesha, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy that's gonna walk up to your front door and say, hey, are you really of Judah or are you of Israel? Now, the Mesha Stele also seems to have other conflicts with 2 Kings 3. Next, the Bible itself seems to limit the whole dynasty of Omri from its beginning to the death of Jehoram to a maximum of about 44 years. So there's a whole question of timing. According to the Masoretic text, Omri reigned 12 years, Ahab 22, Ahaziah 2, and Jehoram 12. So that's 48 years in total. However, because of overlaps and counting the last year of a previous king as simultaneously the first year of the next, it appears that the maximum length of this Omride dynasty is 44 years, assuming that there's no two kings ruling at the same time. So, as kings, they start and they stop, and another king takes over. Sometimes they can rule at the same time, and so we can chop a few years off that. But 44 years, that seems like the maximum length, which is still more than the text of Mesha Stele, which says 40. So in other words, there's no room, even in these 44 years, for a 40-year domination of Moab. So what's going on here? At the beginning of Omri's reign, Omri was occupied with a 4-year civil war with Tibni, during which the time taking control of Moab seems out of place. So, not only would it not make sense for a 40-year domination of Moab, but also Omri wouldn't have been doing this in this 4-year time period. It doesn't make sense for them to be attacking multiple places at once. So it wouldn't have been this in this 4 years. Additionally, Jehoram came to power in the 18th of Jehoshaphat's official 25-year reign. We see that in 2 different biblical texts. So Jehoram came to power in the 18th of Jehoshaphat's official 25-year reign. The battle involving Jehoram and Jehoshaphat against Moab must have taken place in the first half of Jehoram's 12-year reign while Jehoshaphat was still alive, cutting off another 6 years or so from the 44. Now, if this doesn't make any sense to you, that's okay. You can probably just skip it. Not a huge deal as far as the overall argument goes. Now, the date of 2 Kings 3, in contradiction to Mesha's, appears closer to 30 than to 40 from the beginning of Omri's subjugation of Moab. So if we add up all this information, it seems like it's more of 30 than 40. So what's going on here? The Ahab being Omri's son and the Mesha's inscription and Israel's domination only covered much of Ahab's reign. Then it is possible to harmonize biblical chronology with this text statement about 40 years. It's impossible if that's the case, right? That's what some scholars would argue, at least. The Mesha inscription reads, Omri had taken possession of the land of Medeba and dwelt there his days and much, in other words, the text, literally half of his son's days, 40 years. But Chemosh dwelt there in my days. So how do the conservative scholars respond to this? Oh, there's a potential solution. So maybe if we vocalize son in line 8 as plural sons, in which the case of the whole dynasty of Omri, including Ahaziah and Jehoram, could be the reference. So, some scholars have thought that this Mesha Stele is only talking about Omri and Ahab, not the other 2 later descendants. So if you add another 2 descendants in there, maybe that could help you get to that 40 number. Or we understand the term son as descendant. This happens a lot in Hebrew and in other languages. So in other words, when the Mesha Stele talks about the Omri's son, it really should be interpreted as Omri's descendant. That makes perfect sense. That's totally flexible and a normal way to use that word in these languages. Also, if this is the case, Jehoram, as the lost Omride, who tried to subject Moab, would be the reference. So it could be about Jehoram. I think this is what most scholars argue is the case. Also, Mesha inscription, if this is the case, the Mesha inscription emphasizes the beginning and end of the reign of the Omrides, putting the son of Omri literally in parallel with himself as the son of Chemosh Yat, and in the process showing contempt for Jehoram by leaving him unnamed. So maybe the reason it just says the son of Omri and not Omri son of, or Jehoram son of Omri, is because they don't want to give him that much credibility. They want to make him look bad. So the Moabites say the person they're attacking is the earliest descendant they know of. That's another option. Maybe, and instead of trying to be real specific, this Moabites Mesha is like, we're just gonna talk about you as a nation as if you're the earliest guy that we know, kind of like the house of David, that line of David. That's kind of the idea, the line of Omri, because that's kind of the group that you're known for. Okay, and yeah, so there's multiple options as well. So even if we don't even worry about the whole descendant thing, the Mesha still uses the word 40, but we know from a lot of different texts in the Bible and without that the number 40 can be symbolic for like a really long time. 40 could be hyperbole to make what Mesha did more impactful. So maybe they're using the number 40 in the Mesha Stele to make it be like, maybe it was like actually 30 years, but the Mesha Stele raises the number to make it look like they were in there for even a longer time, which would make Mesha look even better for taking them out of that, for doing an even greater thing. The Mesha's statement about the son of Omri, Jehoram possibly, oppressing Moab for half his reign in line 8 may be hyperbole as well. So maybe it wasn't actually half, but they're just using more hyperbole there. A lot of different options here. So this supposed contradiction, I don't really take it that serious. I don't think it's that great of an argument because there's a lot of flexibility in what could be happening here. At the same time, in the Bible, another argument is that Jehoram of Israel is a central figure, but the Moabite stone makes no mention of him. So these scholars are basically taking the opinion that the Mesha Stele is mentioning only Ahab, not Jehoram, but that's probably not right. So there's lots of reasons to think that the Mesha Stele is actually talking about Jehoram. So if it is mentioning of the son of Omri being Jehoram, then it does mention Jehoram, and this argument doesn't make any sense in that case. Next, another argument is that in the Bible, Kir Hareseth, usually identified with El Karak, roughly 20 miles south of the Arnon, is the prominent city in the story. But in the Mesha inscription, the Karho district of Dibon is prominent and does not even mention Kir Hareseth. So let's go to the picture here. So what they're basically saying is that the Kir Hareseth right here at the bottom right, that is only a 20-mile distance from where the Israelites, the coalition, would have been. And it says they took a 7-day journey. So what they're saying is like, are you really telling me it would take you 7 days just to go 20 miles? That doesn't make sense. And if we go back here, on a similar note, if I can find it, yes, at the same time, there's actually not, I skipped one, that's really awkward. Okay, so what they're actually arguing is that the Kir Hareseth is the prominent thing that happens in 1 Kings 3. So at the bottom right here, Kir Hareseth is like the one city that Israel couldn't conquer, and or they just didn't for whatever reason. But the Mesha Stele talks about the area of Dibon as the main situation, the main city, and that's way up here. So if they're talking about the same stories, if the Mesha Stele is talking about a specific city, then that contradicts with what the biblical text, which talks a lot about, or supposedly talks a lot about Kir Hareseth. I don't think this is much of a argument here either, honestly. And the reason is because the Moabite stone is focused on cities in the north. So 11 of the 12 places named in the inscription are north of the Arnon River, and the inscription itself was in Dibon, a northern city. So what it's basically saying is, I need to fix this map, that's what it needs to do. But basically what it's saying is, the Mesha Stele, 11 out of 12 cities are up north, and it was found in Dibon. So it makes sense that the people that would have written it would be talking mainly about the cities that are happening in the north. They're not going to focus all the way down south. And if it wasn't clear, the Arnon River is right here in the whole Arnon. So yeah, that's not a great argument there, I'd say. Also, it's not clear that Kir Hareseth is in the south. So we keep talking about Kir Hareseth in the south in the bottom right, as we were seeing. But the thing is that Isaiah lists Kir Hareseth with other cities north of the Arnon, Isaiah 16:7 and 11. So it makes sense that if Isaiah's mentioning all kinds of northern cities, it's not going to just randomly mention a southern city. It's possible that's happening, but maybe we're just misunderstanding where Kir Hareseth is. And what this writer Sprinkle is like, well, this place Carho related to Dibon is maybe it's to be identified with Kir Haraseth as his royal residence, as Mesha's royal residence. So maybe this is not a place name, but the word for a fortified place capital. So you can read the paper if you want, but yeah, I mean, there's no certain reason to say that Kir Haraseth is the place. So there's a number of different ways to make it. So this argument is really not that great. While we're still talking about it, I did want to briefly mention it's one thing to say, hey, we got a lot of really bad arguments here, okay, and we can kind of just move those out of the way. Not really great. On the other hand, if there are any arguments where we're mainly just saying, hey, it's possible it could happen this way. We don't know. It's not necessarily the most likely thing, but it's just possible. Then on itself, that kind of argument, if there's a say 10% chance of the biblical text being accurate, well, that's not high probability, right? If it's just possible. And not only that, but say it's 50% chance or 75% chance just based off the historical data, then possible doesn't really get us very far. But think about it like this: even if we can find a possible scenario in some of these arguments, that doesn't mean like that's the certain one. It might be the case that when you add up all of these different arguments, where say there's a 75% chance or something like that, 75%, 75%, 75%, if you add up all those probabilities, then that's a lot of different arguments against the text being historical. In other words, one argument you can kind of get away, maybe this is just how it happened this way or this way. But if there's a lot of different arguments against your position, well, that really lowers the probability. So in other words, it's not enough just to say, okay, it's possible it could happen this way, because when you do it so many different times, well, that kind of diminishes the position there. But I'll continue here. Let me know if you have any questions about that in the comments. So the Bible generally ascribes the territory of Moab as from the Arnon River south to the Zered River, and ascribes the entire area north of the Arnon to Gad and Reuben. It appears doubtful from his inscription that Mesha controlled very much territory south of the Arnon, but that Moab's territory was mainly north of the Arnon. In this situation, it's what it's saying is like the biblical text seems to make it so that the territory of Moab, as from the Arnon south to the Zered River, and ascribes it in the entire northern area. So it seems doubtful from his and the Mesha inscription that they controlled very much territory at all south of the Arnon, but that Moab's territory was mainly north of the Arnon. But here's a rebuttal. So Kir Haraseth being north changes the picture. So maybe the biblical text doesn't actually claim that the territory of Mesha had all this area down south. Maybe something else is going on. You can let me know your thoughts there as well. Mesha has a string of unbroken victories in this Mesha Stele. That's really interesting, because the Mesha Stele doesn't say anything about the Israelites and this coalition of kings in 1 Kings 3 destroying all these cities. It's just like Mesha's like, yeah, we took everybody out. We just completely destroyed them. There's no mention of any losses of any kind. While the biblical texts show Israelite victories followed by just one retreat without losses. Now, of course, both texts are this is just normal in history, in ancient history at least. Both texts, they want things to look good. In Egypt, you don't ever talk about the bad things. So, in these texts, it makes perfect sense to say that both texts are ignoring their mistakes because they want their wins to sound better. That's certainly possible. That would not be a surprise. So you know, these in this genre of history of this time period, it's not some 21st century historical journal account. It is completely normal for them not to include losses, or to not include all of the details. So it might just be the case of the Mesha Stele, who is, the text we know with certainty it's trying to make them look good. They're not going to include the losses. That's just normal. I think most scholars would be willing to grant that. Also, the Bible's description of what led to retreat was incredibly vague. This is another argument. So the Bible's description was vague, while Mesha text describes more run-of-the-mill military actions. So basically they're like, well, maybe the Mesha Stele is actually more historical. It's just describing normal military actions, which is typical of history. But the biblical description, at least if I'm understanding this argument correctly, it being vague about the retreat means that, hey, that's not normal of history. And I would just say that I don't see any contradiction here. Actually, the text can be vague if it wants to be. Actually in history, if they don't know something but that actually happens, then maybe that's just a sign of them being honest. And also Mesha Stele isn't describing the battle that went on in detail. So both texts are not being completely exhaustive with the data. And specifically the run-of-the-mill military actions, there really isn't much to see. I don't even see how they could even argue that. It's that's just kind of a weird argument. People can correct me if I'm wrong there. So we'll keep going. I think this is where we really start getting into the interesting stuff. So the Moabite stone writes of extensive building programs in the north, which explains ability to gain independence. So what this basically saying is that the Mesha and the Moabites at this time period, they were able to do all this building stuff, and this makes sense. This makes sense why they're able to gain independence, because they were strong. And otherwise they couldn't do these building programs. And then also the portrayal of Mesha in the Bible makes it look like they barely won. Like they had to do this child sacrifice just to win. And the biblical text portrays it as that they would be unlikely to gain independence at all, really. But they did. So maybe the biblical text is wrong, is what they're essentially saying. But, I don't know if that's great either, because the Mesha still seems to be at the beginning of them getting strong. They're just rebelling. So would we really expect the Moabites to be extremely strong as soon as they are rebelling? That probably isn't the case, but it's possible that it is the case. At the same time, the Mesha still says that they slaughtered and enslaved Gadites, but the biblical text is silent and likely would have mentioned the loss of the tribe of Gad. This is another argument they would make, is that the Mesha still says they have slaughtered and enslaved Gadites, but the biblical text doesn't mention it. Once again, I don't see that as very strong. Because, as Sprinkle says, it is a theologically oriented prophetic narrative, not a historically oriented chronicle. There's a specific purpose that they're writing this text of 1 Kings 3, or 1 and 2 Kings in general. It's not purely historical. There is other purpose, so it's not a surprise that they wouldn't mention the tribe of Gad, like the Mesha Stele mentions. As Sprinkle says, they want to emphasize the sins of Jehoram of Israel, not the sins of Mesha, specifically the sins of not wanting to talk to Elijah about it. So, as we keep going, this one's really interesting. This scholar argues that 2 Kings 3 is dependent on 1 Kings 22. They have a lot of parallels, and that just doesn't happen really often at all in history. So let's go through the parallels. It says, in both texts, an evil Israelite king who typifies unbelief asked Jehoshaphat of Judah to alike my people. Oh, I need to correct this. That's awkward. What does it actually say? It says, what does it say here? It says, in both accounts, an evil Israelite king who typifies unbelief asked Jehoshaphat of Judah to join in a foreign war. And in both, Jehoshaphat agrees with the exact words, I and you are alike. My people are as your people. My houses are as your horses. My horses are as your horses. Both these texts have very similar circumstances, and this guy Jehoshaphat uses the exact same words in both instances. That's really odd. What is that? His catchphrase? That doesn't make much sense at all. Additionally, in both, the godly Jehoshaphat wants to inquire of a prophet of the Lord. So this guy Jehoshaphat, the good guy, he's saying the exact same thing, and he also wants to inquire of the Lord. And at the same time, there is an evil king who typifies unbelief. So you have Jehoshaphat being the guy who believes, the other guy who does not. Third parallel, in both, there is a typical prophetic figure who shows contempt for the king of Israel, but goes on to give the requested prophecy. Now, this would make a lot of sense if this is a theological narrative, essentially trying to make the Judahites look good. They're from the line of David, while Israel, they're made to look bad. And this, so not only is there this comparison between the Israelites who are, or this group of Israel that's looking bad, and then there's Judah who looks very, very good, but also even the prophetic figure says that Judah looks good, whether that be Micaiah or Elisha. And both stories record fulfillment of the predictions and end, unfortunately, for Israel. So it's like, not only does the story make it look bad, but Israel, like, bad things happen to it. It's like, if we're reading it, the ending of the story points us to, okay, maybe it was God's doing for why it happened bad for Israel. And in the first text, Ahab is killed and every man returns to his own city in 1 Kings 22:34-37. And 2 Kings 3, the great wrath comes upon Israel and their withdrawal into their own land. Now, there is arguably also literary dependence. Oh, we skipped that. Maybe. I don't know. There is arguably also literary dependence on Numbers 20, where similarly a cry for water is followed by deliverance by a prophetic figure. So in Numbers 20 and 2 Kings 3, there's this idea of water, people crying, and for deliverance by this prophetic figure. So the figure ends up giving them water. Now, it's the central argument is like, all of these things happening, how could that just be a coincidence and the stories not being based off each other? So Sprinkle's like, well, it's possible that they were genuine parallels in the two events that the storyteller could highlight to underscore his theological purpose. So in other words, in history and just in normal life, similar things happen, not all the time, and this would be pretty crazy that all these similar things would happen in two different instances in this time period. But it's possible. It doesn't necessarily 100% mean that it's not historical. And maybe the storyteller of 2 Kings 3 was like, that's really similar to what happened before. Maybe I should highlight this to make a theological point of like showing how Jehoshaphat's excessively close identification with Israel in her ways represents a betrayal of Judah's vocation to be the true Israel. Maybe there's some deep theological point. And I'm sympathetic to that, but at the same time, it's like, how many parallels do we have to have before we say, maybe it's not just a coincidence. Maybe there actually is something going on here. The question is, what is most likely? When you take all these different parallels, add in with all these other arguments, what is the most likely thing? I'm not like you can say, hey, realistically anything is possible, but what is the most likely thing that's going on here? And the next thing is, even if you say, hey, the text is historical or has lots of historical facts and this thing did happen, what reason do we have to think that the writer of 2 Kings 3, or any text in general, wouldn't be okay with changing a small detail just to make a theological point? There's no reason from a genre perspective or history in this time period that we would say no, a writer would not have been okay with doing that. We see that all throughout this time period, where it be the Sumerian king list, or we see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or all these other biblical or texts in Babylon. Now, I want to say biblical texts, but of course that's what the debate's about. You know, obviously there's lots of scholars who would say, hey, you know, the biblical writers are making stuff up here and there and everywhere, but maybe you don't want to grant that, whatever, okay? But we see that all the time, and even in Egyptian literature, it's normal. So I I do not think it is the case that the writer of this text would have any problem making up one or two details to make it more convey his point, make it more interesting of a story. So the 2 Kings 3 narrative seems improbable for other reasons, according to scholars. One is that in the story, there are 203,000 sheep. 200,000 sheep. I messed up the words there. And rams. And there's a debate about whether it's just sheep versus rams or what's going on there. But either way, 200,000 sheep are involved in Mesha's tribute to Israel, because Mesha is the Moabites are being controlled by Israel, and they're like, hey, give us these sheep or we're gonna beat you up. And Mesha's supposed to give the tribute of 200,000 sheep, but Mesha didn't. And these scholars are like, that is a lot of sheep. That sounds ridiculous. I mean, did they even have that amount of sheep at all in general? That seems like a ridiculous amount. Also, there is other things in the text of First Kings, which is presumably written by maybe a similar author or this same group of people. And in the First Kings, it says that Solomon had 40,000 horses and 1,000 wives. That also seems like a ridiculous number. So maybe that doesn't mean the entire text is not historical, but it seems like at least there are some aspects that aren't completely literal. Maybe they're just using hyperbole. Now, also, there is an impracticable southern route. So the route that these kings take to go and fight Mesha, a lot of scholars have mentioned that this is very impractical, because they have to go from Israel, and whether I don't know for sure whether they have to go all the way down here or they go across this Lisan thing, but however they get across, they would also have to go within or around these essentially mountains, and that's really difficult. There's not a lot of people living around there. How are they going to get water? Is another question. So what scholars have said is it's really unlikely that these kings who knew the area would be willing to make such a dangerous trip, a trip that's probably not going to go well. So that sounds more like a story that is made up rather than historical. And that's an interesting argument there. And so how does Sprinkle respond? So Sprinkle responds by saying the route chosen by Jehoram avoided the main population centers and fortifications of Moab, and instead passed through sparsely populated regions, some of which may have been occupied by his ally Edom. So maybe they went this route because it was occupied by Edom, so there's less chance of being attacked. And if you go north, Well, up there it's more fortified. It'd be a lot harder to get to where Mesha is at. Maybe that's the case, maybe, but that's kind of difficult to argue that. Uh, and not even conservative scholars agree with that line of reasoning. For example, Todd Bolin, the person we interviewed the other day, he says that he doesn't think that um, that the it would have made sense. Actually, he did. Dr. Bolin argues that to go north wouldn't even be that big of a deal. And the reason why that would be the case, if I can find my notes for that, is that Mesha's fortification of the cities on the northern border is, um, it's, they're like, think about it. So Mesha just rebelled. What are the chances that he's gonna have like heavily fortified cities with really good protection? Dr. Bone's like, not likely. If they're just becoming stronger, they're not going to have as heavily fortified cities. Also, Jehoram would presumably be motivated to recover the cities that he's lost. So, if Mesha is essentially rebelling and taking control of all these places, then Jehoram's got to take them back eventually. So might as well take them the easy route going north compared to going through all this treacherous area. And Dr. Bolton says a more reasonable scenario is that these cities were still in Israelite hands when Jehoram attacked. So these northern cities, maybe they were still in Israelite hands when Joram attacked, and his choice of the southern route may have been motivated by a desire to join with the armies of Judah and Edom because they kind of be along the way, and it also avoids the formidable Nahal Arnon, the deep rugged canyon that we've been talking about. So maybe instead of going north, going up here and around the Dead Sea, maybe they didn't want to do that because eventually they would have to go from something like the area of Dibon across the Nahal Arnon, and that would be really difficult. So they think, it's probably not the case that they want to do that. So maybe they would rather go in the area where Judah and Edom already are, pick them up along the way, and then go and attack. So, maybe that makes sense. I don't know. It's an interesting argument that explains a little bit, but there's more questions. There's another question of effortless victory. So, realistically speaking, it seems like both texts talk about effortless victories. Specifically, 2 Kings 3, it's like, yeah, Mesha rebelled, and then the three kings of essentially Israel were like, yeah, we're not having that. So they just go and rampage the whole place after this whole, water pit blood scenario. They just go rampage everything, and then all of a sudden, it doesn't even say that the three nations did anything wrong necessarily. It's really ambiguous. It's just like, oh, they retreated. It doesn't say why they retreated. It doesn't really give you any context. It doesn't even say, oh, they lost a battle and that's why they retreated. It just said they retreated. So it's like, is that really realistic for them to have all these completely effortless victories and then just randomly just leave? That seems very odd. And that's interesting argument. It doesn't seem necessarily historical, but maybe that just means that when they mean these effortless victories, maybe they weren't as effortless as the text is portraying it. Maybe it's kind of using like some kind of like hyperbole. Maybe it wasn't exactly like that, but there's no reason to really get into the details, just like the Mesha Stele doesn't get into the real details. It doesn't mean necessarily the text is not historical, it's just not giving all the details needed. Or maybe there is a question of a need to muster such a great Confederate army and use a circuitous southern route for such an unformidable enemy. So, in other words, it seems unlikely that the the king of Israel and Judah and Edom would all have to come together to face this guy Mesha when he's just rebelled. Like, he's not going to be that strong at that point. So why do they need this great army? And why do they have to go this really odd route that they are risking, not having a strong army, not being well watered, or maybe even food, going this difficult route just for this unformidable enemy? Like, think about it this way. If this enemy isn't that great, which is realistic for the situation, if the enemy is not that great, if Mesha is not that great, then you really don't need all these people to go fight him, and you can take one of the easier routes, and it'll be all right, because even though they might be a little bit more well fortified, the easier route will be doable because the enemy's already weak anyway, so it's not going to matter that much. So, a lot of stuff going on there, a little complicated. That makes things interesting. To add on to that, even the Edomite allies do not know the location of water holes in their own territory. So in other words, all three of these nations get to this area and they're like, shoot, we don't have any water. What do we do? Do we go back? Like, is it really realistic to think that the Edomites who live in this area wouldn't know where the water is? Is it really realistic to think that they wouldn't have wanted to dig a few holes and wouldn't know that there was water underneath there? That seems a little unrealistic there. To add on to that, the stupidity of not considering a strategic retreat when water supplies ran low. Now, this one's interesting. It is easily explained. Maybe that these three kings are just prideful and they're like, hey, we just gotta go. Our guys can take it. They've taken it before. We'll take it again. We'll go a little bit without water. And maybe people are prideful, so that's why stupid things happen in war. At the same time, it's a little odd because the thing with all of this is that it seems like these three kings are doing a lot of stupid things in this story. Is that, like, it's one thing for one person to make a mistake. It's another thing for a king to make a mistake after a mistake after a mistake after a mistake. That seems unreasonable. So not only did they make the decision to go out there, but they wouldn't have made perfect sense for them to just turn around. I don't know how good of an argument that is, because it seems like they did consider turning around, but the Judahite king was like, hold up, everybody. Let's go ask Elisha real quick. Now, as I kind of mentioned before, it's also another argument is that it's improbable that the kings make this 7-day journey, given that the southern border of Moab, the Zered River, is only 20 miles from the capital of Kir Hareseth. So let's see if we can find the Zered River. Zered River. I saw this earlier. I can't remember where it's at. Maybe we can't find it. If we can't find it, we can't find it. That's all right. Oops, that's awkward. Oh shoot, whatever. Maybe someone could tell me where it is. I don't see it. Whatever. So, just believe me, this is an argument that some scholars have made. So the argument is basically that wherever this is, the Zered River, which is the border of the Edomites, that is not that far. It's only 20 miles from the capital of Kir Hareseth. So is it realistic that they would take 7 days to just go 20 miles? And Sprinkle is basically like, well, if Kir-Hareseth is north of the Arnon and the northern Moab, then the Bible statement about a 7-day journey that the Confederate army required becomes plausible rather than absurd. So if it's actually longer for them to get there, then maybe the 7-day journey makes more sense. Maybe it's not actually 20 miles. I think this one really stands out to me, is Elisha is kind of just there in the story. Like, it doesn't really seem like it doesn't really make sense at all why Elisha is where he is when the kings need him. So the kings are making this journey, and it doesn't really make a ton of sense. You can come up with a plausible explanation, but at the same time, realistically speaking, this is a dangerous journey that they made, and some would say even stupid. And they make this journey, but realistically speaking, if they're going to go in this area where there's nobody's out there, there's no cities out there, then it just makes very little sense that Elisha would be there. So what are the chances that these 3 kings would show up there in this random place where there's no cities, and they need a prophet, and it just happens to be Elisha, the most popular guy out there? Why would he be out there? That just doesn't make any sense. He's just randomly out there. That seems like a crazy coincidence. And then also, there's another argument where there's a lack of archaeological confirmation of the biblical invasion and that evidence of widespread destruction layers in the 9th century Moab. Well, basically what they're saying is there's not a lot of evidence to the south where this is all supposed to be going on. All these battles are supposed to be going on. And it's like, well, if there really was all these battles, we would expect to see it in archaeology. We don't see it in there. One response would be like, okay, maybe we just haven't found it. We haven't really dug all that much. It's like something like 99% of things haven't been excavated. We really haven't found all that much. Also, if Kir-Hareseth is in the north, well then that makes sense that we actually have found it. We just don't necessarily know it. And there's a lot more, essentially destruction levels, places of war that happened up there that we can see in the archaeology. So if Kir-Hareseth is actually up north, well then that makes sense, and we actually do have evidence for it. So that maybe that would destroy that argument. So that was a lot of different things, and I just wanted to read a nice little summation of basically what I think is maybe the strongest way to look at this. So not only do we have all these different parallels. Oh shoot. You guys probably couldn't see that. Well, that's really awkward. You just gotta trust me, okay? You just gotta trust me. But so, because I'm not doing this again. But anyway, so there is just really a lot of arguments here, okay? There's a lot of arguments for this text not being historical. Some of these arguments aren't very good. Some of them are more interesting, more difficult to respond to. So, is it possible that this text is 100% historical? Yes, definitely. It's definitely possible. The question is, what's the most likely thing? And not only do we have all these parallels between 1 Kings 3 or 2 Kings 3 and then this other text in 1 Kings, where it's like, that seems relatively unlikely that we would have this many parallels in an actual historical event. I mean, what are the chances that the same person in both texts says the exactly the same thing? That's very odd. A lot of different parallels there. But also, if I can say this, lots of scholars say the route they took is ridiculous. And that makes sense, because if you are a king, you're not going to want to take a route that's going to end bad. That just doesn't make any sense. That seems like something that wouldn't happen from a historical perspective. And in the story, it actually ends bad. So, like, that's verification that, hey, maybe that wasn't the best route to take. The only way that it works out is because Elisha just happens to be there, which is also very unlikely that this prophet, the most popular prophet out there, just happened to be just hanging out. And he just happened to be able to save the day. Even though the solution that Elisha used, it didn't actually require a miracle. So did they really even need the prophet? No. The Edomites should have been able to know that there was water if they just dig. So just basic knowledge of how digging holes in this environment will give easy access to water, which people in the area would have known, that just seems unlikely as well. So there's just, like, what are the chances that all these unlikely things in the story would happen? It's very unlikely. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, well, I don't care, Zach. I just really don't care, because the Bible is historical. It's true. It's historical, and it's just a trust thing, right? I don't care how many arguments you give me. It's a trust thing. I can sympathize with that. I would completely agree that if this text is claiming to be historical, and we already know that it's verifiable, that we can verify a lot of these facts in the story already, it would make sense. Okay, things in history happen that are unlikely. Like, what are the chances I'm going to win the lottery? Like 1 in millions, right? But someone every day wins the lottery, or something like that. People win the lottery all the time, even though that's extremely unlikely, right? So things in history, coincidences occur, right? At the same time, the question is, what is the most likely thing? And as I said before, you might be thinking, okay, well, the Bible is historical, and it's just a coincidence it looks like that, and we should just trust the Bible. But the question for me in that case is, what is the most likely thing? So the people in this perspective were like, the Bible is historical because it has to be historical, right? Because it's inspired. Well, I can understand that logic. The question is this text even claiming to be historical? Because everybody agrees that just because something's in the Bible doesn't mean it's necessarily historical, right? The parables of Jesus, almost everybody agrees. The only people that do not agree that the parables are not historical, or everybody agrees that the parables are not historical. The only people that don't are extremely conservative people. All right, if you're watching, you're probably not that type of person. Okay, everybody agrees that the parables are not historical. The question is, what genre is this text? And as I said before, there's all kinds of texts from this time period that aren't historical. The idea of history as we know it today did not exist at that time period. Nobody debates that, okay? History, like we know it today, didn't really even start until Greek civilization with Herodotus and around that time period, what is it, 300 BC or so? So this idea of this is a historical text, we have to completely accept it as historical, I think that's not very informed, because guess what? That genre didn't exist, and if it didn't exist, then this text is not claiming to have 100% historical events all throughout it. If this is not a historical thing, maybe it's more like a parable. It mentions some historical people, but doesn't completely mean that everything is 100% historical in it. Maybe that's good reason to think that, hey, we shouldn't expect this to be 100% historical. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm perfectly fine with saying, hey, it's historical if the evidence says so, but there's also a lot of arguments and just things that really are unlikely if this is a 100% historical text. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check out the other interview with Dr. Todd Bowen, where we talk about his understanding of the text. Just for yeah, we'll get into that later some other time. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe. Let me know what you think. It's okay to if you wanna call me a bad person or a heretic or whatever. Just hopefully you can give me your argument for why you think that. Don't just call me that. But anyways, it's been a pleasure. Glad you could watch, enjoy us, and I hope you guys have a good one.